You probably grew up seeing images of a crucifixion in churches, in movies, in books. That scene that became a symbol of sacrifice, of unconditional love, of religious piety. But here's the thing no one has told you clearly. Crucifixion is not a quick and glorious death. It is a slow death, deliberately designed to be one of the most humiliating and painful forms of execution that Rome practiced. And most importantly, when modern forensic doctors studied what happened to the human body during a Roman crucifixion, they discovered something significant. The ancient texts, those biblical texts that were written more than 2,000 years ago, include details that researchers believe correspond remarkably with what medicine and archaeology reveal about how a crucifixion actually worked. This is no coincidence, and it's not just religious speculation. It's documented evidence that deserves our attention. Today, we're going to discover together what historical and scientific research has revealed about the crucifixion. We'll explore the biological mechanisms that researchers believe were involved. We'll see what archaeologists have found in tangible evidence. And, perhaps most importantly, we'll understand why knowing these details completely changes how you read and understand this story. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, atheist, Jewish, or simply someone curious about history. This is a deep dive into forensic science, archaeology, and ancient history that will surprise you. So, shall we begin? Before we can understand what happened to the body of a crucifixion victim, we first need to understand why Rome chose this method. And the answer is disturbing. In the 1st century AD, when Jesus was crucified, Rome was an empire that controlled virtually the entire known world. But maintaining control of such a vast empire is no simple task, especially when there is revolt, especially when there are people challenging Roman authority. Therefore, Rome developed a clear system of execution. It wasn't just about killing the criminal. It was about making an example of him. It was about demonstrating power. And what was the best way to do that? The crucifixion. Understand this. In Rome, there were various ways to execute people. Decapitation was quick. Burning was spectacular. But crucifixion was different. Crucifixion was specifically designed to be slow, to be visible, to be humiliating. Who was crucified? Primarily 3 groups: rebellious slaves, criminals condemned to death, and, this is important, revolutionaries who challenged the power of the state. People Rome wanted to make an example of. People Rome wanted everyone to see suffer. It was common during days of rebellion in Jerusalem, and there were many in those times, for dozens, sometimes hundreds of people to be crucified. The roads around the major cities were littered with bodies on crosses. Historians of the time report this. Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century, describes situations where hundreds of people were crucified simultaneously. He witnessed this personally during the Jewish revolt. Why recount all this? Because crucifixion was not rare. It was not an extraordinary death. It was a common death for those who defied Rome. And that means there were many opportunities for testing, refining, and technically improving this death. Now, let's get into the details. And be warned, this is going to get visceral, but it's important. A Roman crucifixion had stages. It began before one even climbed onto the cross. The condemned person was first taken to be flagellated. This was not just a whipping. According to historical accounts, it was a systematic procedure where the victim received multiple lashes. Some ancient accounts mention numbers as high as 40 blows. with an instrument that accounts describe as having bone and metal attached to a rope, often called a flagrum by historians. Based on these historical descriptions, researchers believe this would cause severe damage to the skin and tissues, with significant blood loss. There are ancient accounts mentioning that people died solely from the flogging. In this case, however, the victim needed to survive to reach the next step. Then came the transport. The condemned man was forced to carry, often, the horizontal beam of the cross to the execution site. Imagine a body already severely bruised from the flogging, losing blood, being forced to carry heavy wood through the streets while the crowd spat on and humiliated him. Upon arriving at the execution site, the victim was completely stripped. The nudity was intentional. It was part of the humiliation. He was there, exposed for all passers-by to see. Then, the crucifixion itself would begin. Now, here's an important detail. There isn't a single Roman cross shape. There were variations. The most common was what we call the crux immissa, the T-shaped cross with the vertical post longer. But there was also the crux commissa, which was more like a capital T. The method of preaching also varied. There were two main models. Model 1. Nail the feet and hands directly into the wood. Yes, actual nails, going through the nerves and bones. Model 2. Tie the body with ropes, with nails only in the feet or hands. Which was more common? Studies show that there were likely combinations. Some limbs nailed, others tied. The nails were thick. They weren't small. Based on historical accounts and archaeological evidence from the nail found in Yochanan, researchers estimate that crucifixion nails were approximately 15 to 20 centimeters long, with a wide head. The purpose was twofold: to keep the body secured and to prevent the body from falling downwards, because a thin nail could tear the fabric. The nail was driven through the wrist, not the palm as many artistic depictions show. And here's why. A nail in the palm wouldn't support the body's weight. You would literally tear your hand apart. The nail in the wrist, however, went through a bony and muscular structure that could support the weight. The feet were often nailed together or separately in front of the post. In some crucifixions, there is historical and artistic evidence suggesting that there was a small wooden support called a sedile that supposedly supported the feet and relieved some of the body's weight. However, there is debate as to whether this was standard in all crucifixions or only in some. Why am I telling you all this with such technical details? Because every detail matters for what comes next. Every detail affects what happens biologically, medically, to the body. The question everyone wants answered is, how exactly does a person die in a crucifixion? The answer that most researchers, medical examiners, anatomists, forensic medicine researchers, consider the most likely is asphyxia. But it's important to be clear here. This isn't a 100% scientifically certain answer. There's legitimate debate in the academic community about whether asphyxia was the primary mechanism, or if other factors like shock, heart failure, or a combination of several factors were just as important. What we can say is that asphyxia is very likely a significant factor. Let me explain why the researchers arrived at this conclusion. When you are standing, your body uses a set of muscles to breathe. The main one is the diaphragm, that muscle located below your lungs that contracts to help you inhale air. But there are other muscles as well, the so-called intercostal muscles, which are located between the ribs. Normally, when you're standing, this works well. You breathe without thinking. Now, imagine yourself on a cross. Your arms have been raised upwards at an angle of about 60 to 70 degrees. Your body is hanging. Your weight is pulling you down. In this position, there is a serious mechanical problem. Your intercostal muscles can no longer contract efficiently. Why? Because they need to contract in a specific direction, upward and inward, to aid in inhalation. But when you're hanging on a cross with your arms up and your body weight down, that contraction is restricted. It's like trying to move a muscle when there's opposing pressure. This means that your breathing depends almost entirely on the diaphragm. And the diaphragm, by itself, cannot move enough air to keep you alive indefinitely, especially not when your body is in an upright position with all your weight compressing your internal organs. So, what happened? The victim began to gasp for breath. Breathing became rapid, shallow, and inefficient. Blood oxygen levels were beginning to drop. Carbon dioxide was starting to accumulate. In this situation of respiratory distress, there is something that most victims did. They were pushing each other up with their legs. Imagine, you're hanging there, unable to breathe and starting to panic. The only way to relieve the tension in your arms and give your intercostal muscles a little rest is to push yourself up, using your leg muscles, using your feet to lift your body slightly. When you do this for a few seconds, your breathing improves. The pressure in your lungs decreases. You are able to breathe better. But you are exhausted. Your muscles are extremely fatigued. You have serious injuries all over. You have lost a lot of blood. Then your muscles say, "I can't take it anymore," and you collapse again. And the cycle begins again. Go up. Breathe. Go down. Can't breathe. Panic. Go up again. Repeatedly, sometimes for hours. But here's the important thing. Death isn't just from simple asphyxiation. It's more complex than that. Remember, the victim had been flogged before. He had lost a lot of blood. He was dehydrated. He had open wounds all over his body. The body's position in a cross-like position also causes something called edema, fluid buildup. Because the body is hanging vertically, gravity pulls blood downward, especially to the legs and feet. This causes extreme swelling. This puts more pressure on the chest. It further worsens the respiratory situation. And there's more. The heart. When you're experiencing extreme respiratory distress, when oxygen levels are dropping, the heart is under tremendous stress. It beats faster, trying to compensate. But without enough oxygen, it begins to develop abnormal rhythms. There may be fibrillation. The heart beats irregularly, inefficiently. This can lead to a heart attack or cardiac arrest. In addition, there is kidney failure. When you are trapped in an immobile position, your kidneys begin to fail. When you are severely dehydrated and in shock, the kidneys fail even more rapidly. So, technically, the researchers believe that the death could have resulted from several simultaneous causes. Progressive asphyxia, possibly the main factor, possible heart failure, possible kidney failure, hypovolemic shock, shock due to blood loss, possibly even infection of the open wounds, depending on how long it took for the person to die. The exact combination likely varied from victim to victim. How long exactly? Well, that's where it gets relevant. Because depending on the circumstances, the victim's health, their strength, how much blood they lost during the flogging, the time varied greatly. Some historical accounts mention victims who died within a few hours. Others mention victims who took days, hanging on a cross. There are reports of 3 days, a victim still alive on the third day of crucifixion. Now let's turn to archaeology, because although there is a lot of historical documentation about crucifixion, there is one specific artifact that changes everything. In 1968, in Jerusalem, during excavations in a cemetery, archaeologists discovered a heel bone, a bone of the foot, with a nail still piercing it. This bone belonged to a man named Yohanan, who was likely crucified between 7 and 70 AD, exactly the same time period in which Jesus was crucified. This is the only skeleton of a crucifixion victim ever discovered archaeologically. And what does this skeleton tell us? Medical confirmation of several things we suspected. 1. The nails really existed. It wasn't just a method of tying. There were actual nails. The nail went through Yochanan's heel bone. 2. A specific type of wood was used. Analysis of the nail and bone structure suggests that the wood was from an evergreen tree, possibly acacia wood or similar. 3. The technique varied. Based on analysis of Yochanan's skeleton, there is evidence that the nail was positioned at an angle, not perpendicular, but at an angle that researchers estimate to be approximately 45 degrees. This suggests that there was no single standard procedure. There were variations, adjustments, and different ways of nailing depending on the victim and the circumstances. 4. The trauma marks are consistent with the reports. The bone shows signs of trauma consistent with a body under extreme stress, marks of torsion, marks of compression. But here's what's perhaps most revealing. When modern anthropologists studied Yochanan's skeleton, they were able to perform biomechanical analyses of how the body would have been positioned in a cross-like fashion. Based on these analyses, they suggest that the body would have been in a position that indicates, according to their interpretation, someone attempting to support themselves and breathe better, consistent with the mechanism we discussed earlier. It's as if we're potentially seeing evidence of a person desperately trying to push themselves up to catch their breath, although that's an interpretation of the data, not a direct observation. This is where things get more specific and revealing, because there are some very concrete details in the ancient texts about crucifixion that seem very precise, very technical, very medical. Let's start with 1. Break the legs. In 3 of the 4 Gospels, there is a detail. When the soldiers arrived to break the legs of those who were crucified, a procedure called Crucifixion, they broke the legs of the 2 men beside them, but when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they did not break his legs. Why would anyone break the legs of someone who was crucified? Well, remember the mechanism we discussed? How a person needs to push themselves up with their legs to breathe better? If you break their legs, the person can no longer do that. Broken legs cannot support themselves. The body can no longer lift itself up. Progressive asphyxiation accelerates dramatically. Breaking the legs was, in effect, a method to hasten death, to end it quickly. Now, why does this appear in the texts if it weren't true? Why specify such a specific, technical detail if it were an invention? Here's another one. Chest fluid. In the Gospel of John, there is a specific detail. When the soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear, blood and water flowed out of him. For centuries, people have interpreted this as something mystical, symbolic. But when you look at it through a medical lens, there's an interpretation that researchers take seriously. When a person is experiencing progressive asphyxia, in severe shock, there is an accumulation of fluid around the lungs and around the heart, called pulmonary edema. This fluid is mainly water, serum, with a little blood. If you were to puncture the chest under these circumstances, theoretically and physiologically, you could see blood and water coming out. Some medical researchers argue that this detail is too specific to be an invention. Others are more skeptical about this specific interpretation. What is certain is that it is not impossible from a medical point of view. Again, why would someone invent this detail if they hadn't witnessed it personally? It's a valid question that researchers are asking. This is where I want to spend some special time with you. There is a relevant phenomenon in academia. When historians and archaeologists analyze the Gospels as historical documents, not as sacred texts, not as dogma, but simply as ancient accounts, they frequently encounter a level of detail that raises important questions about the sources of these accounts, especially regarding the details of death by crucifixion. For example, the description of the place, Golgotha, a place of skulls, the description of the hour, 9th hour, details of the previous flogging, the offering of drink, often interpreted as wine mixed with myrrh, which was a commonly used analgesic at the time. The strange detail that the clothes were divided by lottery. The presence of spectators who ridiculed. All of this is present not in one gospel, but in multiple gospels, often with slight variations that suggest different sources, not copies of each other. Historians interpret this in different ways. Some argue that the presence of multiple sources with these variations is a sign of independent sources reporting real events. Others offer alternative explanations. There is no absolute consensus. Now, there are elements on which researchers clearly disagree. The darkening of the sun, for example, whether it was literally dark from noon to 3 in the afternoon, or if it was a poetic description. The Great Earthquake. Is there archaeological evidence of it? Inconclusive. Some modern researchers, including forensic doctors who have specifically studied crucifixion, point out that certain medical details in the texts remarkably match what physiology teaches. They speculate about how someone in the 1st century could have known these details with such precision. But this remains speculation and academic debate, not a proven scientific conclusion. I want to be honest with you here. Not everything is agreed upon. There is a legitimate debate in academia about some aspects of crucifixion. For example, the main mechanism of death. Although asphyxiation is the most widely accepted explanation, some researchers argue that hypovolemic shock or heart failure could be as, or even more, important than asphyxiation. The truth is, it was probably a combination of several factors, and the determining factor could vary from victim to victim. Time to death. How long did it actually take? Hours? A whole day? The variability was so great that it's difficult to give an exact number. It depended on many factors. The exact method of nailing. Not all crucifixions used nails. Some used only ropes. Some researchers argue that ropes were more common than nails. We don't know for sure. The height of the cross. What was the exact height? The archaeological evidence is not clear enough. Why am I telling you this? Because it's important to be honest. Science doesn't have all the answers. And that's okay. That's how science works. You ask questions, you collect evidence, you arrive at conclusions based on what you know, and you acknowledge uncertainty. The most reputable researchers in the field, people like Alexander Metherell, a physician who has studied this extensively, always leave room for debate and for revising conclusions as new evidence emerges. So, after learning all of that, after understanding the mechanics, the biology, the archaeology, the history, what's the point? Why should you care about that? Let me tell you. Something happens when you truly understand what crucifixion was. Not as an artistic image, not as a religious metaphor, but as a concrete biological reality. If you are a Christian, this understanding changes everything. Because you stop reading "Jesus was crucified" as an abstract concept and begin to read it as a specific, concrete reality of suffering. You begin to imagine, not in a morbid way, but honestly, what that was like. The panic over breathing, the shock to the body, the time. If you're not a Christian, this understanding also changes everything, because you stop ignoring the amazing technical details of these accounts. You start to wonder, how did people in the first century describe this with such medical precision? And that opens the door to genuine respect for the historical text, regardless of whether you believe in anything supernatural. But here's the most important lesson I want to leave with you. When you truly understand what someone has suffered, when you don't deny, downplay, or romanticize the suffering, you become more empathetic. There are people in your world who are suffering, not literally crucified, but suffering. Chronic pain, illness, depression, anxiety, abandonment. When you train your mind to not look away from suffering, when you learn to be present with the pain, to understand the pain, not to minimize the pain, you become a different person. You become someone who can be there for people who are suffering. You become someone who doesn't offer cheap platitudes, who doesn't say, "Everything will be all right," when someone is facing something genuinely difficult. You become someone who says, "I see your suffering. It's real. You're not alone in it." And that is an extraordinary gift. So here's the lesson. Understanding breeds empathy. Empathy breeds compassion. And compassion is the antidote to much of the isolated suffering that people experience. I am genuinely grateful that you came with me on this journey, for venturing into uncomfortable territory, for allowing science to challenge or deepen your understanding of a historical event that matters to billions of people around the world. If this video touched you in any way, if it sparked your curiosity, made you think differently, or deepened your understanding, then I ask you a favor. Subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a casual request. It's because I understand that you're someone who values in-depth knowledge. Someone who isn't satisfied with superficial answers. Someone who wants to understand, really understand, the topics that matter to you. And if you subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video when it arrives. Because there are more stories to come. Stories about the Bible, about history, about architecture, about culture, about everything that connects us to the past and helps us live better in the present. Your teachers should have taught you these things. Your history books should have included this depth. If they didn't, let me bring these stories to you. Thank you for being here. Until next time.